There is a second itihasa as well. The second itihasa that we have in our tradition is called Mahabharata. Mahabharata is the most profound epic, and it is the largest epic that exists in any literature, in any culture in the world today. Mahabharata is made of 100,000 verses. Just for context, Hanuman Chalisa has 40 verses. The Bhagavad Gita, which we spent 108 nights studying very quickly, that has 700 verses. Then the Tulsi Ramayana, which is, when you look, it's such a big book like that. Tulsi Ramayana has about 12,000 verses. So the Mahabharata is almost 10 times bigger than the Tulsi Ramayana, which already feels like such a magnificent work. So you can imagine how vast this Mahabharata is. It is huge, right? So it is an itihasa. And just like the Mahabharata, it talks about history. So the theme of both Ramayana and Mahabharata is the same theme that comes across our entire Vedas. The goal, it teaches us dharma, it teaches us how the goal of life is moksha, it exposes to us how we can go about living our life. This is what we see common in these two texts. And usually these two texts are compared with each other. They're pitted against each other. But the style is completely different between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. For example, I'll tell you, Ramayana is called the Adarsha. Adarsha literally means the ideal. So the Ramayana is considered, it presents life as the ideal. See, Bhagavan Ram is the perfect son, he's the perfect brother, he's the perfect husband, he's the perfect king. There's everything about Bhagavan Sri Ram is perfection. Correct? Then you see the brothers. Bharatji is the perfect brother, he's the perfect seva. Kausalya is the perfect mother, and Ravana is the perfect wicked person. There's perfection in every single character in the Ramayana. And in the Ramayana, you will not see things, there is no vague dilemmas, really speaking. Everything is very clear about what the right thing and the wrong thing is to do. You have perfect characters that form perfect ideals for us, whether good or bad. So Ramayana is filled with perfection. But now you think, in the world, do you find perfectly good or perfectly evil people? Elite people. Are you perfectly good or perfectly evil? Not a single person here can say, I'm 100% good or I'm 100% evil. Everyone will have a mix of the two, correct or wrong? Everyone in this world will find themselves a mix of good and bad. There is no such thing as perfectly good or perfectly bad in the real world in which we live. Okay. Or like, how many of you have found yourselves at crossroads where you had to make a decision? Like every day, like 100 times a day. Now, the big decisions that we have to make, are they usually black and white? Very clear what the right thing is to do, or are they more gray? If I do this will happen. If I do that will happen. I'm not sure which one to do. Does that not characterize the experience of most people when it comes to making serious decisions? Vagueness means things are gray. You could justify how it is dharmic either way. That is what we find in the world, right? We find things not so black and white, we find them more gray. And so the Mahabharata is different from the Ramayana in that it is called Yathartha. Means it presents life as it is. It doesn't present an ideal, it presents life with all its complexities, with all its negativities, with all its realities, in the way that we know the world today. So every single character we will meet in the Ramayana, you will notice and you will observe and you will see that they have something great, but they also have something negative. Whether they're called the good guys or what they're called the bad guys, they will have something good about them, and they will have something bad about them. For example, Yudhishthira, who was Arjuna's brother. Everyone knows Yudhishthira. He's famous. He's Dharmaraj. He's the son of Dharmaraj, right? In spite of being so noble, he had a weakness. What was his weakness? His weakness was gambling. He couldn't say no once he started to gamble. So such a great dharmic person, and he also had a weakness. Right? Then on the other side, you see someone like Karna. Karna's fighting on the bad guy side. But he is the exemplar of a Danavir, meaning somebody who is so undescribably heroic in giving. So you have people who are so good on one side, and they also have such negative qualities in them. And then you have people who are so bad on one side, and then they have such good qualities in them. And that is exactly what we see when we look out in the world. Is that not your experience? You see people with both good and bad in this world. So in the Mahabharata, what happens is these characters are going through real life dilemmas, and this text is there to emphasize how it is not easy to figure out dharma, and it is also not easy to do dharma. Dharma is not an easy thing to do all the time. Actually, I should take back that statement. Not all the characters in the Mahabharata have good and bad. There is one character in the Mahabharata who is perfectly good. One character in this entire Mahabharata, hundreds if not thousands of characters will be there. One character who is perfectly good. And that is our Bhagavan Shri Krishna. The only perfect being in this world will be Bhagavan himself. If we are not an avatar of Bhagavan, it is impossible for us to be perfect beings. But the irony is that even though we are not perfectly good, we demand those around us to be perfectly good. And when they are not, we think, but how could this happen? How is it that you're not perfectly good? But we forget that perfection of goodness is something that is only a characteristic of an avatar of Bhagavan. And so the Ramayana is meant to present ideals to us, but the Mahabharata is meant to present life as it is. So as we go through this Mahabharata, please remember the context and the purpose of it, and it cannot be compared to the Ramayana in the same way. It means we can't think of it like we think of the Ramayana. It has its own place in teaching us how to analyze dharma. Mahabharata is most fascinating because every character that we meet is not only outside in the world today, but every single character in the Ramayana, in the Mahabharata, is actually inside us ourselves. So the Mahabharata forms a mirror into our mind. It exposes us to the Duryodhana in our mind, to the Arjuna in our mind, to the Yudhishthira in our mind, to the Dhritarashtra in our mind. It exposes us to all these wonderful characters that have goodness and weaknesses existing simultaneously in them. And going through the Mahabharata, we start to question how we can face life when we are confronted with gray situations. Face life, follow dharma, achieve the greatest good. This is what Mahabharata is. One other thing that Mahabharata does is it shows the interconnectedness of all of this. The story spans generations, literally spans generations, 4 or 5 generations. Effortlessly, you'll see a connection between 5 generations and how a decision that was made in generation 1 is still affecting generation 5, not decades, centuries later, right? And it is a nice reminder that actually what our ancestors did hundreds and hundreds of years ago is what determines where we are today, who we are today, why we are people we are today and why our lives are the way they are today. Mahabharata makes it very evident that we are so interconnected, not just to those around us currently, but to those from whom we have come generations before. Another really wonderful reason why people study the Mahabharata is because our Pujya Gurudev Swami Chinmayananda describes it like this. He says the Bhagavad Gita, which is the most practical manual on living life in today's day and age, he says that Bhagavad Gita is like a diamond. And a diamond can be appreciated on its own. But, you know, when you put a diamond, when can you appreciate a diamond the most? Is it not when you go to that jewelry store and they have it in a really nice fancy box, some blue box or black box or something, and somehow against that box, the cuts of the diamond shine brighter. In the same way, Bhagavad Gita is like the diamond, and the Mahabharata is like the box in which that diamond is put to shine more brightly. When we study the Mahabharata, we get a whole different perspective, a whole different value, a whole different understanding of the Bhagavad Gita, the importance of its teaching, and how it is that it is playing out the way it is. So it is very insightful for Vedanta students also to study this Mahabharata. Okay. Now I can go on and on about the importance of the Mahabharata and its glory, but we should leave some for other days also, otherwise we'll never get to the actual wonderful story. Right? But before we get into the story, the tradition is to start with the author. Who wrote the Mahabharata? Well, the author of this most inconceivable epic is our Bhagavan Veda Vyasaji. Veda Vyasaji, out of compassion, saw the need for this. He realized that the content of the Vedas and the way that the Vedas are presented is not something that we would be able to relate to so easily in today's day and age. And so with his foresight, he thought, I should leave something for them to be able to think about Dharma in their day-to-day life, to be able to face the problems that they're going through from today to tomorrow, to face the negativities that are in their personality right now. So like this, with his compassion, he thought, I should write this Mahabharata. And so he invoked Brahmaji and he told him this idea. And he wants to compose this Mahabharata, and the thoughts have just started to flow. And he says, and Brahmaji says this is an excellent idea, you should go ahead with it. And Veda Vyasaji says, no, but you know, if the ideas are forming in my mind so quickly, I'm going to need a scribe. I'm going to need someone who can write them down. Because, you know, when you're trying to write something and think something at the same time, it's very difficult sometimes. So having someone who will write on your behalf allows you to think a lot more quickly. So he said, well, can you recommend someone who can be my scribe and write it for me? And Brahmaji said, well, I think that the perfect scribe will be Bhagavan Ganesha. Buddhi Devata, Siddhi Devata, he will be able to do this very well. And so Veda Vyasaji says, okay, Brahmaji, will you ask him for me to be my scribe? And Brahmaji said, no, we don't have any, what is it called? Intermediaries in our tradition, you go ask him directly. So he goes and now he sits and he invokes Ganeshji and he requests Ganeshji to be the scribe of this monumental epic that he's about to write. And Ganeshji listened to his proposition and he said, I don't mind being your scribe, but I have a condition. And what is that condition? The condition is, you're not allowed to stop dictating. You're not allowed to stop composing. Means the moment that you stop, I will stop writing. So you always have to be, the ideas always have to be flowing endlessly. And so Veda Vyasaji thought, well, I have Bhagavan Ganesh who's willing to be my scribe, I have to find a way to make this work. And so he said, okay, fine, but I have a counter proposal for you. What is that? He said, I accept, but my condition is, you are not allowed to write down anything without understanding it fully yourself first. So Ganesh thought, and he said, okay, deal. So now these two made a deal, and they started to write this wonderful Mahabharata. So Veda Vyasaji starts to dictate, and Ganeshji starts to scribe. And it is said, as he was scribing, whatever he was using, it broke. His pen broke, and that is when he broke off his tusk. You know, he's called Ekadanta, he has just one tusk. He broke off his tusk so he could continue to write the Mahabharata. Now it is also said that, you know, at some point it becomes hard, you get writer's block, it becomes hard for ideas to keep flowing. You want a break to restructure ideas and all of that. So it said when Veda Vyasaji wanted to stop to think for a little while, he would tell such a complex verse that Ganeshji would get stumped. And Ganeshji would have to stop writing and he would have to think for a good while about what that verse was saying. So then he would think about it, and then he would eventually write it down, and Veda Vyasaji would have composed some few hundred shlokas in that meanwhile, and then they continued. The only thing is nobody knows what those verses are. They say there's about 600-700 verses that are so cryptic that even Ganeshji had to pause to think about them. Now, because we don't know which ones they are, it means that we cannot take even one single verse for granted in the Mahabharata. It might be the description of a tree, and you might be like, oh yeah, that's just a tree, next verse. But that might be the verse which made Ganeshji stop. And so, this is told to remind us that every single verse is meant to be contemplated upon. And so we don't read Mahabharata mechanically. The other thing is that if Bhagavan Veda Vyasaji, is the one who is composing this, and Ganeshji himself is the one who is writing it, it cannot be the ordinary story of an ordinary family in some random time period in history. It means it has to be something that is really meant to teach us something. And the condition that was kept is very insightful for us actually. Mahabharata is supposed to teach us. When we're taught something, we're supposed to learn, then we're supposed to think about it, and only after we think, we're supposed to act. See, Ganeshji had to listen first, then he had to think, and only when he understood was he allowed to write it down. What do? We do, and then we regret. And then we feel guilty about things that we did. So, when we remember what Ganeshji's requirement was, it reminds us also, first we think, and only when we understand and we're clear, then we act. So this is how the Mahabharata was written. But when you read the Mahabharata, it is not written Ganeshji said this or Veda Vyasaji said this. It is given as a dialogue between completely different characters. So now let me tell you a little bit about how this story was given for the first time. You know in Bhagavatam, even though Veda Vyasaji is the writer, is the author of Bhagavatam, the story goes, right, that one day Parikshit Maharaj, who was the grandson of Arjuna, he was in the forest and he was very, very thirsty. And he ended up at the ashram of a sadhu who was meditating, a rishi who was meditating. And he didn't realize that the rishi was in samadhi, in deep meditation, and he asked for water and he didn't get any. And so out of anger, he took a dead snake that was lying there and put it on his neck. And he left. Well, the rishi was in samadhi, he didn't know anything. Right? But the son of this rishi came with his friends. And they were laughing and saying, look, your father has a dead snake on him. And this son got really angry. And he said, whoever has done this to my father is going to die in 7 days. And they were going to die by the bite of a snake, because it is a snake that they put around my father's neck out of instinct. And so this is the backstory, and then Parikshit Maharaj finds out because the Rishi says, "What have you done? This is such a great king, and at least he should know so he can prepare," and all that. And then we see how Parikshit gives up the entire kingdom, and for the 7 days he goes and he asks Shukadevji Maharaj to tell him the Bhagavatam. And that is how the Bhagavatam was told. Even though Veda Vyasaji is the author, it is told by Shukadevji to Parikshit Maharaj. So now fast forward one generation, and Parikshit Maharaj has just died. Well, he has dropped his body, he left his body, means he attained samadhi before that snake could bite him, but that snake came and bit him, and then he died. Right? His son, Janmejaya, got very angry that how is it that a snake could come and kill my wonderful father? And so this Janmejaya wanted to take revenge now on the fact that a snake had come and killed his father. Not that snake, all snakes. He wanted to take revenge on all the snakes in the world because one snake had come and bit his father. So he did a yajna called a Sarva Yajna. And this yajna was such that when the mantras were chanted, wherever snakes were in this entire universe, they were helplessly pulled into the fire, into the yajna. And so this yajna had started, and Janmejaya was taking revenge on all snakes. And all of them were being sucked into the fire slowly, 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 and they're getting burnt. And so this havan is going on, and snakes are being burned. And Takshaka, the snake who had actually bitten Parikshit Maharaj, he runs and he goes to Indra Devata. And he coils up around his throne, and he says, "Please, please, please, you have to do something, you have to save me." And so the Devatas send a Brahmana to that yajna. His name is Astika. They send a Brahmana to that yajna. And you know, when a Brahmana comes, whatever you are doing, you have to ask them what you can do with it. And whatever it is they say, you have to do it. There's no choice, there's no option. So this Brahmana comes, and Janmejayaji says, pronounce, "Please tell me what I can do for you." And he says, "I want you to stop this yajna." Well, he had no choice. Right then he had to stop that yajna. And so all the snakes were saved as a result of that. Now the wonderful thing is, you will hear these stories and they sound confusing. Why would there be someone sitting there and watching snakes get burned in the fire? Well, the symbolism in this story is that all of the thoughts we have are like the snakes. Now there will be good thoughts in our mind and there will be bad thoughts in our mind. Just like there's good snakes and bad snakes, right? There's snakes that poison, and then you have snakes like Shisha. Right? Even in our tradition, you'll see all different varieties of snakes. So Janmejaya had released his anger on all snakes indiscriminately. Now, is that not what we do too? We get angry at everybody, whether they are good or bad, whether they have anything to do with why I am angry. I get ready to release my anger on them. This is a very common thing that we see. When I'm angry, everyone gets burned. Everybody in front of me gets burned. Well, the thing is, he was trying to burn both the good and the bad. But this Astika is one who believes in the Vedas. He came and he explained to him and he stopped the yajna to show that it is only negativity that should be burned. Not everything indiscriminately when you get upset. And so Janmejaya says, "Okay, fine, you stop this yajna, but I'm still angry. I'm still upset. What about that?" And it is at that time that Vaishnampayana Rishi, who is a disciple of our Bhagavan Veda Vyasaji, he teaches him this Mahabharata. He tells this story. Everyone following? here is very instructional for us. You know when disturbing things happen in life and we are overcome with sorrow? It could be death of someone, it could be a disease, it could be bad news, it could be anything. Our tradition is to study the scriptures. It's to engage in satsang. Because when we are in sorrow, if we hold on to the scriptures, they have the power to take us out of that sorrow. What happens normally is when people get drowned in sorrow, they go and drown themselves in other things. And those things suck them further into the sorrow. It doesn't actually benefit them in any way. But this story reminds us that when we are in sorrow and we hold on to the scriptures, it has the power to take us out of that sorrow. Janmejaya had great sorrow that his father had died. But the solution was not to kill all the snakes in the world. The solution was to be in satsang. And so, holding on to scripture is what happened to him, and he was given the Mahabharata. If we face the sorrows that come to us with this instruction, we will be able to deal with anything that comes to us. Now, Bhujan asterisks there. It doesn't mean the only time for satsang is sorrow. I mean, even in sorrow, we should turn to satsang because it is the scriptures that will pull us out of this sorrow. So now, over these 14 nights, we are going to be reflecting on the wonderful, fascinating story called Mahabharata. It is impossible to tell the 100,000 verses, even in brief. So we will not be seeing everything. We will be seeing the main storyline of this Mahabharata. The central story in the Mahabharata is about the Pandavas and the Kauravas. I'm sure you would have heard those names. And the Bhagavad Gita comes in the middle of this Mahabharata. But the story actually starts much before the Pandavas and the Kauravas even come into picture. It starts about 3 generations prior with a king named Shantanu. Just before I tell you, I wanted to chant a couple of very famous verses in this regard. Let's see. Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama, Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama,
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 Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama, Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama.
Yatra Yogeshwara Krishna, Yatra Kavanodharvara,
Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama, Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama,
Tatra Shri Vishayobhuti, Purani Kripate Namah.
Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama, Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama,
Dharme Chari Chadami Cha, Moshi Cha Bharatarsha.
Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama, Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama.
Yane Hasita Ranyaka, Yane Hasita Tatvachita, Shri Krishna Kanhaiya Lal ki Jai. It is said that whatever exists in this world is there in the Mahabharata, and whatever is not in the Mahabharata is not in the world. Meaning there is nothing that anyone can think, can be, can act, can face that has not already been dealt with in the Mahabharata. As we go through the story, you will see that every character is presenting to us things that we actually see, if not inside us, definitely outside and around us. Okay? So now, 3 generations prior to the Pandavas and Kauravas, there was a king in the Bharata dynasty called Shantanu. He was a noble king, a great king. And one day, he was walking along the banks of Gangaji, and he ended up seeing a most beautiful woman. She was so beautiful that she looked like she wasn't human. Her beauty is described that he thought she was like from some other world. And he couldn't stop looking at her. He couldn't take his eyes off her. She was beautiful from head to toe. He went up to her like being pulled by a magnet. And he said to her, I don't know who you are, but I love you and I want to marry you. That is called love at first sight. He saw her and he just felt like she had to be with her. And she looked at him. And the way she looked at him, he realized that she must love him too. And she said, I accept your proposal, but I have a condition. What is her condition? I'm ready to marry you, but from now, you're not allowed to ask me any questions. You're not allowed to ask why I'm doing what I'm doing. You're not allowed to challenge me on any of my decisions. You cannot ask me why. That is it. Anything I do, you have to accept as I'm doing it. Does that sound familiar? Anyways, Gangaji had this stipulation before she got married to Shantanu. But now you know what happens when someone has just fallen in love and they are smitten. They agree to everything, whether it makes sense or not. So he said, yes, of course, anything. And he accepted her condition and the two of them got married. Well, the wonderful thing is that he didn't have anything to worry about because for the lady who he got married to was really wonderful. She happened to be, her name was Ganga, and she actually happened to be a divine being. And she was a wonderful wife. She kept him so happy that he didn't have to ask her anything. As time passed, they had a son. Now you know when a king gets a son, that is a very, very significantly special thing. Because now he has an heir to the throne. And so he is overjoyed that he has got a son finally. And he is rushing out to go meet Ganga and meet his beautiful son. And he reaches her chambers and he is told that she's not there. She has taken the child and walked out of the palace. And he's wondering, newborn means a mother who has just given birth. Where is she going with this child? And so he goes out of the palace and he sees the most horrendous sight which he can never forget his entire life. Ganga, this perfect, wonderful wife, has taken his first child, who he hasn't even seen yet, and drowned that child in the river. And he is staring and saying, what is wrong with this woman? He wants to go and say, are you crazy? What did you just do? What is with you? But what was the condition of marriage? You're not allowed to ask me anything. You're not allowed to question anything I do. Actually, I forgot to mention. She said, the day you question what I do, I will leave you and this relationship will be over. That was the condition of their marriage. So now, on one side, he loves this Ganga so much. On the other side, this son who he was waiting to meet is gone. What can he do? He's torn and he stays quiet. Well, time passes and a second child is born. And this time he thinks, okay, finally. And he goes and sees her doing the exact same thing. Not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. He sees his wife Ganga taking their child to the river the moment the child is born and drowning that child in the river. Well, time came around for child number 8. And child number 8 is always significant. So now child number 8 comes around. And he follows her. And as she's about to release this child into the river, he shouts, "Stop! What is wrong with you?" And with full anger of all those 8 children and all those years where he couldn't say anything, he screams at her. "What kind of inhuman act are you doing? What is wrong with you? Where are your motherly emotions? How can you kill these children like that? I haven't even seen them and you're drowning them one after another." And she looks at him and she says, "You are not allowed to ask me anything. Now time has come when I must leave you." And so he's confused. He has just expressed such intense emotions, and what he has gotten in return is, "Bye, see you later." He cannot understand what is going on. And so she backs up. She understands, she sees the confusion in his face, and she backs up. And she says, "Let me tell you what happened. Actually, I am not an ordinary human. I am Ganga. I am the Devi of the river. I am a celestial being, actually. I'm a Devi, I'm not a normal human. But it so happens that I was cursed to be born on earth, to come down on earth. And you, in a previous life, had done really great karma. You had done so much punya karma that you ended up in Swarga. And there you were in Swarga, and when I entered Indra's court, you looked at me with desirous eyes. And I also looked back at you with desirous eyes. But that was not the time or place for that kind of looking at each other. And because of that, the Devatas got upset and they cursed us. They cursed us and said that, well, you don't deserve to be in Swarga anymore, and you were sent back to earth, and you came as Shandalu. And they cursed me to come to earth too, and to join you for this period. And so he thinks, and she said, "Well, now that you have questioned me, our time is over." And he looks at her and he's like, "Okay, fine, all of that might make sense, it's going over my head. Put that on pause. What about these children? Like, where do they fit in? Are they part of the curse too?" And she says, "Yes. Actually, these are not ordinary children. They happen to be the 8 Vasus. 8 Vasus are their other celestial beings. Right? These 8 Vasus had gone and stolen Vasishta Rishi's cow. You know Kamadhenu, that wish-fulfilling cow? They had gone and tried to steal that Kamadhenu in an act of wickedness. And they got caught. And they were cursed to leave their special position and come down and be born as regular human beings. I mean, we're calling it regular. Human birth is very special, but from the point of view of a Devata, they think that is superior and human being is being a lower one. Right? So they did not want to live as human beings for long. And so they made a deal with me and requested me to be their mother. And they said, as soon as we're born, can you send us back? Because the curse was that we have to be born as human beings. So once we're born, release us from that curse and let us come back to our original status. And she said, that is why when they were born, I was fulfilling their wish and sending them back to their realm. But what about this 8th child? You know, this 8th child was the mastermind Vasu behind the whole thing. You know how there's usually a mastermind and there's followers? So the other 7 children, they were the other 7 followers. This one child, this one Vasu, who was the mastermind behind this whole plan, his dharma cannot be finished so easily. He has to live a long time now to face the results of the action that he did. And I tried to stop it, but fate has its own plans, Prarabdha has its own plans, and now this child will live. This 8th child will live. This son of ours will live. I am going to take him up to Swarga, to my realm, and I am going to train him to be the best heir of this country, this kingdom. Hastinapur was the name of the kingdom. I am going to groom him into the most wonderful future king of Hastinapur. And saying that, she takes this baby and she leaves. And now Shantanu is absolutely heartbroken. He has lost the love of his life, and he has lost his 8 children, and now he has nothing but emptiness in front of him. Like this, years pass by, and the only thing that he enjoys now is hunting. Hunting is the only thing he enjoys, but still there's nothing that he can do to break the sorrow that he's going through. Anyways, one day, with his long face, 16 years later, he ends up walking along the banks of Ganga. And he sees something he has never seen before. He sees that this mighty flow of the Ganga River has been stopped by some arrow barrier. Someone has gone and shot arrows in such a way with such technical dexterity that the water, the flow of Gangaji herself has been stopped. And as he's looking at this marvelous sight, unfathomable for the flow of power of Ganga to be stopped by anything, at that time, he sees Ganga. And he says, Ganga, you have come back to me, you felt sorry for me, and now you're back? Finally, after all these years, you feel pity on me, and you're come to me? And she says, no. Actually, I'm here for a different reason. And as she starts to talk to him, a young boy comes and says, Mom, look what I did. I stopped the flow of the river again. And he looks at her and he said, this is your son? This is our son? And Gangaji says, yes, this is our son. His name is Devavrata. I have brought him up in such a way that he will be the perfect king for Hastinapur. He has had such great gurus. Vasishtha Rishi himself was his spiritual guru. Parashuramji himself has taught him archery. There's nothing that he doesn't know. He has been trained by Brihaspati, the guru of the Devatas, on political science. He is positioned perfectly, and now I am returning him to you. And so Devavrata does pronounce to his father Shantanu, who he's meeting for the first time in his life. And Gangaji, now Devavrata is looking at Gangaji saying, you're leaving? He spent 16 years of his life with his mom, and now he says, you're leaving? And she says, whenever you think of me, I will come, and I will meet you. And saying that, she leaves. And now, Shantanu is not alone anymore. He doesn't have Ganga, but he has his son, Devavrata. Devavrata is such a wonderful young man. He wins over the heart of every single citizen in the kingdom. And very quickly, his father is inspired to make him the Yuvaraja, what is it called? The crown prince. Meaning, when something happens to Shantanu, or if when he renounces the throne, then the next king is going to be, officially announced, the next king is going to be Devavrata. And so like this, Shantanu and Devavrata were inseparable. Inseparable means inseparable. They spent all their time together. His father was overjoyed to have him. It's like he was living those 16 years he missed in these years that he had with Luna. And like this, 4 years passed. 4 wonderful years passed. But Shantanu still had a void in his life. He still felt that void of how Ganga had just left one day. He felt alone. One day, he was walking along the banks of a river. Banks of rivers seem to be dangerous to him. He was walking along the banks of a river, and this time it was the Yamuna River. And he suddenly felt, he got a whiff of a fragrance that he had never smelled before. It was such an intoxicating, beautiful fragrance that he couldn't help himself. He had to, when your neighbor is chunking something, then your nose just goes there helplessly, like that. But imagine the most wonderful thing that you've ever smelled in your life. So now he starts to follow it and tries to trace, where is this divine smell coming from? Maybe he thinks it might be some flower that he's never seen or something. He traces it, and it ends up not being a thing, it ends up being a woman. This woman from whom this wonderful fragrance is emanating. And he looks at her and he says, and she's tying a boat. She looks to be like from the fisherman's community, And so she's tying a boat over there, and he goes up to her and he says, who are you? You are so beautiful. I want to marry you. That's his dialogue, I guess. He says, you are so beautiful, I want to marry you. And her name, she says, my name is Satyavati. I don't mind marrying you, but you have to ask my father. Will you please come and ask my father? So now Shantanu goes to the father. Actually, as a king, and in those times this was allowed, the king was allowed to kidnap anyone they wanted and take them to their kingdom. But he didn't. He went to the father of Satyavati and he said, I am in love with your daughter. I would like to marry her. And now this is a citizen of this country. Imagine the king of the kingdom going to a citizen and saying, can I marry your daughter? What a great honor it would be for that daughter to get a fisherman's daughter to become the queen of the kingdom where she lives. Which father will say no? Well, this father said, I don't have a problem with you marrying my daughter, but there is a but. What is the but? The but is that I was told in her horoscope that her children are destined to be kings. Now the problem is, you already have a son, his name is Devavrata, and he is already the crown prince. So if you marry my daughter, and she has children, her children will not be the heirs to the throne because there is already an heir to the throne. So unless you can promise to make my daughter's children the king, you cannot marry her. That is my condition. Now imagine Shantanu's condition. He has fallen head over heels in love with this woman. And on the other side, he sees Devavrata's whole life ahead of him. He sees the promise he made to Devavrata, for Devavrata to be the next king. So he rejects the proposal and he leaves. And he goes back to the kingdom. But when a desire is not fulfilled, it expresses in some way or another. Is it not? The people closest to you know that something is wrong. So he goes back and he tries to live like normal. But Devavrata senses that something is different with his father. Something has changed. And so he asks his father, what happened? What are you going through? Tell me. I want to know. Why is it that suddenly you're so gloomy and sad? You're not cheerful. You're not yourself anymore. Something has changed. What happened? And his father tried to, make stories and avoid the topic. And he said things like, well, you're my only son. If something happens to you, then what will happen? So I'm thinking about these things and I'm worried. And Devavrata was smart. He knew that his father was making stories. But his father wouldn't tell him anything. So now how do you figure out what the truth is when the person is not telling you? He thought, and he went to the charioteer of the king. You know when you want to find out what is going on in a house? You find the people that are working there and you ask them. So now he goes to the charioteer of this king and he asks, why is this king so sad? What happened? Did something happen one day when you were out with him? And he says, well, I'm going to get in big trouble if I tell you, but I will tell you. So he says, actually what happened is he saw this woman, her name is Satyavati. He went and asked for her hand in marriage, and this was her father's condition. And because of that, your father did not accept it, and he's facing the sorrow of not being able to be with her. And the dilemma of not taking the kingdom away from you. So now Devavrata got angry. And he said, how dare someone say no to my father, the king? That is not acceptable. And so now he says, take me to that man. Take me to that fisherman. And so the charioteer takes Devavrata to the fisherman. And he says, excuse me, I hear that you have put a condition on your daughter marrying my father. And the fisherman says yes, and he reiterates and he says, well, you are going to be the king. And so because you are going to be the king, my daughter's children will not be the king. And so therefore, she cannot marry her father because her children are destined to become king. Well, Devavrata thought. And he said, if that is the case, I renounce the kingdom. Let her children be the heirs to the throne. I don't mind. For my father's happiness, I renounce that. It is not, imagine someone in power. Instantly, effortlessly, giving up all of that power. He did that in a blink of an eye for his father's happiness. The fisherman was shocked. He looked at him and he said, well, that is wonderful, you are a great person, but what will happen when your children come? And your children feel like the throne was wrongfully taken away from you, and therefore the throne actually belongs to them. Then what will happen? Then there will be a problem, there will be fight. So, no, I still don't accept. And at that time, Devavrata takes a vow. He proclaims loudly, he says, I vow to never get married. If I don't get married, I can't have children. If I don't have children, there is no issue. He takes a vow to be a Khanda brahmachari. To be a brahmachari, a celibate for life. You're not talking about someone who's on the spiritual path, who wants to do nothing but study the Shastra. You're talking about someone who is a prince, who's meant to be a king and have a queen and rule a kingdom and all of that. He renounces in a moment for his father's happiness. He vows, he takes the vow on the name of his gurus. He doesn't just take the vow like that. He swears on his gurus and takes this vow. And because of the intensity of the vow that he has taken, from the Akash Vani, you start to hear this word from the heavens. They started to say Bhishma, Bhishma, means this terrible thing has just been done. Means he has taken such a terrible vow that say it was Bhishma. And as a result of that vow that was taken, he ended up getting the name Bhishma. He took a third vow. He said, not only will I not sit on the throne, whoever it is that is sitting on the throne, I will serve that person. I will serve the throne of Hastinapur for my life. And having made these vows, now the fisherman gives Satyavati to him and says, here is your mother. And Bhishma now takes Satyavati back to the father. When Shantanu hears what happened, he's flabbergasted. I mean, the vow has been taken. There's nothing he can do anymore. But he sees how this child who was supposed to have his whole life ahead of him has sacrificed all of it for his father's happiness. His father, who has already been married and already had children and everything, but he sacrifices all of that for his father's happiness. It is worth thinking, did he do the right thing or did he not do the right thing? Only time will tell, but that is something that we ought to think about. Shantanu, overwhelmed with emotion for what his son has just done, with all the accumulated power of tapas that he had, he gives Bhishma, his son, a boon of Ichcha Marana. Means Bhishma can choose to die whenever he wants. He gives him a boon to die whenever he wants. And then he gets married to Satyavati. Okay, we'll pause the story there. I want to think a little bit for just a couple minutes with all of you on a few things, a few of these episodes. See now, when Ganga was drowning the children, it looked like a horrendous, heinous act from an outsider's perspective. How could she be doing that kind of thing? But if you know the backstory, then that same thing which looks like the most inhuman act suddenly looks like an act of compassion. Instantly, it changes from an act of terrorism to an act of compassion. She was acting out of love and care and consideration for the jiva who wanted to return back to their loka. And so, it is very important for us to remember that it is not enough for us to judge an act at surface level. There is always a backstory. We may not know the backstory. Like, you know, the iceberg? The classic example is the iceberg. You can only see the tip of the iceberg. But the fact that the iceberg is there, it means there is a huge part of it underneath that we have no idea about. This encourages us to invoke compassion in our heart. When we see something and we cannot make sense of it, we have to resort to, there must be some other reason. You know, as the Mahabharata goes along, and you see how much this Bhishma has to go through, sometimes you actually wonder, you know, it would have been better for him if she had just drowned him too. And he didn't have to go through this intense life that he had to go through. But at that time, it looked like, how can you do this? So that is one very, very important thing we learn from that story. The other thing is, we have to stop to reflect on the consequences to the next generations of the decisions made in the present generation. None of our actions are insignificant. And the choice that the fisherman made to say that his daughter's children must be the heirs to the throne, well, that decision affects generations to come. We will think about it a little bit more tomorrow, but we should remember that actually nothing that we do is insignificant. Absolutely nothing that we do is insignificant. It has ripple effects for generations to come. And today being the first day of Pitru Paksha, it is a really good time to remind ourselves to reflect on what our ancestors have done that has allowed us to be who we are, where we are. Because it is actions that they would have taken that has determined our current life. Actually, this 2 weeks of Pitru Paksha is meant for us to reflect on the sacrifices of our ancestors and offer our gratitude to them. It is not merely about the physical action of tarpan, it is about the emotional attitude of gratitude for all the things that they have done. So as we go through the Mahabharata and we see how the consequences of each generation compound into the next generations, we should also keep thinking what our ancestors would have done to compound into our current times as well. So we will pause this here and remember that nothing that we do is insignificant. Tomorrow we will see the impact of the vow that Bhishma took, and we will see the impact of the insistence of the fisherman that his grandchildren should be heirs to the throne. Actually, that is the starting point of a whole set of problems in this Mahabharata. We think we know what's good for our children. People really think they know what is good for their children. But we're not the ones who know. So give thought to that. Now see, all these names. Shantanu's name is going to disappear tomorrow. More names are going to come. Those names are going to disappear. More names are going to come. So you can really get lost in this whole labyrinth of names, but don't lose the thread of the story and how each episode builds into another. And most important is, what does this teach me for the way that I live my life? So we barely cracked the beginning of the story. It is generations of stories are yet to come. So you're very welcome to join us nightly. If you can't come in person, everything is in West Coast and this area, East Bank, Essequibo, and West Coast, Demerara, here across the bridge. So please feel free to check the schedule and join us wherever you can. Tomorrow we're going to be in Zealand. I think that's close by, right? Zealand's close by. So please feel free to join. Reading the Mahabharata is one thing, and listening to the story is another. It just, I don't know, I like it when someone tells a story. So if you are the same and you would like to join, please do. If you can't come in person, it will be online. Okay? We will stand for RP. And then announcements, and then I'll invite Maharaji, right? We'll do RP. We'll do Bhagavad Gita. Because I don't know about the Ramayana, Mahabharata RP.
Thank you.
Whenever that is.